3 bone-chilling true road trip horror stories you won't believe. The headlights cut through the darkness, but they only seemed to make it worse. The road stretched endlessly, a black ribbon in the middle of nowhere. Each bump in the pavement felt more pronounced now, a constant reminder of isolation. Sarah gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. She was alone. The radio had stopped working hours ago, leaving only silence to fill the air. Every now and then, the sound of tires skimming across the rough road was all she could hear. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but it was empty. No sign of the car that had been following her for miles. Her breath quickened. A distant howl broke through the stillness. It wasn't a coyote. It sounded human. The hairs on her neck stood up. She told herself to focus on the road, to keep going. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The wind outside began to pick up, whipping against the sides of the car. It howled, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed almost purposeful. Her heart pounded louder with every gust. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the wind died down. The eerie silence returned. She looked out the window again, only to freeze. The shadow of a figure stood at the edge of the road, just beyond the beam of her headlights. It was tall. Too tall. And motionless. Her pulse raced as her eyes locked onto the figure. She couldn't move, couldn't blink. The car crept forward. Closer and closer. The figure didn't move. But then, just before she passed it, something shifted. A pale, hollow face turned slowly toward her. Her breath caught in her throat. The car jerked forward as she slammed on the gas, speeding past the figure. But she couldn't shake the image of that face. The empty eyes staring back at her. The mouth that didn't move, yet she could feel its cold, mocking smile. Sarah forced herself to look ahead, but her mind kept replaying the encounter. She kept driving. She didn't stop. Not until the gas ran out. The engine sputtered, then died. Silence again. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. The empty road stretched out before her, dark and endless. She hadn't seen another car for miles. No lights, no signs of life. Only the heavy, suffocating silence. Sarah tried to restart the engine. Nothing. Her breath grew shallow. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Panic began to rise in her chest. She wasn't sure what to do next. She had to keep moving. But where? The figure. That face. She could still see it in her mind's eye. The hollow eyes. The twisted smile. The cold breath that seemed to follow her. A sudden noise snapped her back to reality. A faint scratching, coming from the roof of the car. She froze. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The sound grew louder, closer. A soft thud. A shuffle. Something, or someone, was up there. Her skin crawled as the sound moved along the roof. She didn't dare look. What if it was there? Right above her, watching. Her thoughts raced. A sudden screech echoed from above. She screamed, pulling herself away from the wheel. A dark shape skittered across the windshield. Her heart stopped. She locked eyes with the figure. It was no longer on the road. It was above her, its pale fingers tapping on the glass. A raspy breath fogged up the window. Then, in a blink, it was gone. The air grew thick, suffocating. Sarah didn't dare move. Her mind screamed at her to run. But where? She was trapped. And then, in the distance, headlights. A car was coming. Relief flooded her body. But as it drew closer, something was wrong. The car wasn't slowing down. It was speeding toward her. Faster and faster. The brakes never screeched. Only the sound of tires grinding against the road. And then, in an instant, the car was upon her. Its headlights flooded the interior of her car. She squinted, trying to make out the driver's face. But there was no one there. The car passed, vanishing into the night. And then, for the first time, the road was silent. Sarah's hands shook as she looked out the window. She could see nothing but darkness. The figure was gone. But she wasn't sure if she had truly escaped. The silence pressed in on her like a thick fog. Her chest felt tight, like a heavy weight had settled there. The road ahead was still empty. No other headlights. No signs of life. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But the air felt wrong, thick, unnatural. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror again. Nothing. Still empty. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Of something lingering just out of sight. The tension was unbearable. She turned the key again, praying the engine would start. It hesitated. Then, finally, it roared to life. The relief was brief. Her fingers trembled as she slowly eased the car into gear. She didn't want to stay there. Not another minute. But as she began to drive, a strange shadow flickered across the road. For a moment, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks. But it wasn't. It was moving, slowly, deliberately. Something tall. Looming. And it was headed straight for her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the wheel tighter. The shadow grew closer, its outline more defined. It was human-shaped but far too tall. Its legs bent unnaturally, jerking in erratic motions. Her pulse quickened, every instinct screaming to flee. But there was nowhere to go. The road was narrow. And the figure was closing in. Her foot slammed on the accelerator. But the car didn't respond. The engine sputtered again. The shadow was right there now. Right on the edge of the headlights. She could see it clearly, its face, pale and hollow, just like before. Its eyes glowed in the dark. And those lips, they weren't smiling anymore. They were stretching, opening, revealing something that shouldn't have been. Teeth, sharp and gleaming, row after row, filling its mouth. The air grew colder, freezing her to the bone. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the figure. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her hands shook uncontrollably. And just as she thought it was too late, the car lurched forward, the engine roaring to life. She pushed the gas pedal all the way down. The figure lurched toward her, but she didn't look back. Not even once. She kept driving, faster than she ever thought she could. The headlights flickered, but she didn't care. The sound of the tires skimming the rough pavement was all she could hear now. It was the only sound left. And the further she drove, the more she felt that pull. That sense of something behind her. She couldn't outrun it. Not this time. The road would never end. And it would always be there, waiting. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the road bending in ways she couldn't understand. The darkness pressed in from all sides. No matter how fast she drove, it felt like the distance wasn't getting any shorter. The shadows on the horizon twisted, mocking her attempts to escape. Sarah's eyes were blurry with exhaustion, but she refused to blink. She couldn't risk it. Not with that thing behind her. Her hands gripped the wheel like a lifeline, but the shaking wouldn't stop. She could still hear it. That growl. Low. Deep. A sound that felt like it was coming from inside her skull. Something in her gut told her the road was changing. Curving in ways it never had before. The trees lining the sides of the road now felt unnatural, twisted, gnarled, like they were reaching for her. But she didn't dare look. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, even though every nerve in her body screamed for her to stop. She didn't stop. She couldn't. The car's headlights dimmed. The engine sputtered. The lights flickered again, casting strange, erratic shadows across the road. For a brief moment, everything went completely dark. Then, a flash. A figure. There, standing in the middle of the road. The same figure. Tall. Looming. Its hollow eyes reflected the dim light. Sarah slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car jerked, the tires screeching as they tried to grip the pavement. She barely had time to scream before the figure lunged. A sickening crack. The car shuddered violently. Her chest slammed into the steering wheel. The world spun. Blackness. And then, silence. The sound of her breath was the only thing left. She opened her eyes slowly, but she wasn't in the car anymore. She was standing on the road. In the same place the figure had been. The car was gone. The road stretched endlessly, but it wasn't the same road. It was distorted. Warped. The trees twisted and writhed like something alive. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she couldn't move. Then, behind her, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Heavy. She turned around. And there it was. The figure. Now closer than ever. Its smile twisted unnaturally wide. Its teeth glinted in the fading light. And in that instant, Sarah realized. There was no escape. Not now. Not ever. The road would never end. And she would never leave. The air around her grew thick, suffocating. The figure's footsteps echoed, each one a bone-rattling thud. It wasn't walking anymore. It was gliding. Its movements were unnatural, like it was floating just inches above the ground. Sarah couldn't breathe. Her body refused to move, frozen in place by something worse than fear, *Dreadstar. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The figure's eyes never left her. Those hollow, black voids seemed to pull her in, deeper and deeper, until she could feel them inside her skull. It was getting closer. The air turned colder, biting through her clothes. The wind picked up, howling in her ears like the sound of 1,000 lost souls. The figure stopped just a few feet away, standing perfectly still. It tilted its head, studying her with that empty, malevolent gaze. And then, it smiled. But it wasn't a smile of malice. It was something worse. It was a smile of recognition. As if it had been waiting for her all along. And Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that it had. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her throat tight and dry. She was drowning in it. The figure leaned in, so close she could feel its icy breath on her face. Its lips barely moved, but she heard it clearly. "You've always been here." The words were cold, hollow, echoing in her mind. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "No, this can't be real." But the figure just smiled wider, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. "You can never leave," it whispered. Its teeth gleamed in the darkness. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, to ripple like water. The world began to bend, distort, twist. The trees around her no longer looked like trees. They were faces, contorted, screaming, their mouths open in silent agony. The road itself seemed to pulse, alive, with a mind of its own. And Sarah realized with a sickening jolt that she was no longer on the road at all. She was in a place between worlds. A place where time had no meaning. Where the road, and everything on it, was a prison. The figure stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step. It reached out, fingers like claws. Its hand brushed her cheek, cold as death. And in that moment, Sarah understood. She had never been driving down that road. She had never been escaping. She had always been here. Trapped. With no way out. The figure's smile stretched wider, and the world around her collapsed into darkness. And then, there was nothing. The darkness swallowed her whole, thick and suffocating. No light. No sound. Just an endless void. For what felt like eternity, Sarah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her body was weightless, lost in the nothingness. And then, a flicker. A single point of light appeared, distant but undeniable. It pulled her, a magnetic force she couldn't resist. Her limbs began to stir, reluctant, but awakening. Her chest rose and fell, ragged breaths filling her lungs. She pushed herself forward, though she wasn't sure how. There was no ground beneath her. Only that light. And as she moved closer, the light expanded, becoming brighter, larger. It was blinding. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The light grew until it consumed everything around her, overwhelming in its brilliance. Then, suddenly, the light vanished. Sarah stumbled, the world coming back in fragments. She was there. Back on the road. The same road. The same stretch of endless black asphalt beneath her feet. She stood, shaking, her clothes torn, her skin pale and slick with sweat. The air tasted like ash. Her heart hammered in her chest as she glanced around, disoriented. It was still night. The same endless night. But something was different. Something had changed. The road was no longer straight. It twisted, forked, bending impossibly in all directions. She looked behind her. There was no car. No sign of her escape. No memory of how she had ended up here. And then, a voice. A whisper. It came from the darkness ahead. Her breath caught. The figure. It was there. Not far away, standing in the middle of the road, as if it had been waiting for her. Its pale, gaunt form barely visible in the dim light, but those eyes. Those eyes still gleamed. Empty. Hungry. Sarah backed away, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The figure stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The smile crept across its face again, twisted and cold. "You never left," it said, its voice an echo that filled the space around her. The words reverberated in her skull. She turned, but there was no way out. No place to run. The road stretched endlessly in all directions, and the figure was always just ahead of her, watching. And the terrifying truth crashed into her. She was never meant to escape. This road, this nightmare, was her eternity. And it would always be waiting for her. Her breath came in sharp, desperate gasps. The road seemed to stretch out forever, a never-ending loop that she couldn't escape. The figure's shadow loomed over her, darker than the night itself. With each step it took toward her, the air grew colder, suffocating. Sarah tried to move, but her legs were frozen. It was like the earth itself was holding her down. The figure was so close now, she could feel its cold presence, a chill that burned her skin. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, filling her with an overwhelming sense of despair. It wasn't just a creature. It was a force. A force that had always been there, waiting for her. "You can't run," it whispered, its voice like ice scraping against bone. Sarah's throat tightened. Her mind screamed for her to fight, to do anything to break free. But she felt trapped. As if the road itself was alive, pulling her in, keeping her here. She stumbled back, her eyes darting desperately, but there was no escape. The figure's smile grew wider, impossibly wide, its mouth stretching unnaturally. It didn't just stand there, it watched, always watching, waiting for the moment when Sarah would give in. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, rippling like water, warping reality. Her knees buckled as the world around her twisted and contorted, the trees reaching out like claws, the sky warping into a black void. It was all wrong. The road, the air, the very ground beneath her, none of it was real. And then, with a sudden, jarring lurch, the world stopped moving. The figure was gone. Sarah was left standing alone in the middle of the road. Her breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. The cold still clung to her, sinking deep into her bones. Was it over? Had she escaped? She looked around, her heart racing, desperate for any sign of change. But all she saw was the same endless road. The same dark, empty stretch of black asphalt disappearing into the horizon. And then she heard it. The faintest sound. A whisper. Her name. She turned, but there was nothing. The road behind her was empty, just the same endless stretch of darkness. But as she stood there, breathing heavily, she felt it again. The unmistakable presence. The figure. It was closer this time, not far off, just beyond the reach of her vision. And she knew. She would never be free. She would never escape. The road had claimed her. And it would always claim her. Forever. The figure took another step forward, and Sarah felt the cold settle deeper into her chest. She wasn't alone. And she would never be alone again. The figure's presence surrounded her, an oppressive weight that pressed on her chest, crushing her with its unseen force. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. It was as if the road itself had become a living thing, pulsating with dark intent. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the vast emptiness. Every direction seemed to blur together, the road twisting and shifting underfoot. It was no longer a place. It was a prison. Her heart pounded faster as she took a step backward, then another. But the figure followed, moving toward her with unnerving stillness. She glanced around again, desperate for any way out, but everything was the same. The same road. The same nightmarish landscape. The trees no longer looked like trees. They were twisted faces, mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with horror. The road stretched on forever, its end swallowed by an abyss that seemed to be closing in on her. She tried to turn and run, but her legs betrayed her. It was as if the very ground refused to let her go. Her foot caught on something, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. The cold, hard surface of the road bit into her skin. And then the figure was right there, towering over her, blocking her view of everything else. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, filled with that same unbearable emptiness. "You can never leave," it whispered again. Its voice was like the wind, cold and unfeeling, threading its way through her mind. The smile on its face stretched wider, impossibly wide. And for a split second, Sarah thought she saw it, something behind the figure, lurking in the shadows. A face. A familiar face. Her own. She blinked, her mind scrambling to process the image. Was it her? No. It couldn't be. The figure's smile turned into a grin, as if it had heard her thoughts. It leaned in closer, its cold breath brushing against her ear. "You're already part of it now," it whispered, its voice a razor-sharp edge against her soul. And then everything went black. The road was gone. The figure was gone. The trees, the sky, the air, all of it disappeared, leaving her floating in an endless, oppressive void. There was no escape. No way to fight. She was trapped in this place, a prisoner of the road, a prisoner of the endless night. And she understood, with a cold, terrible clarity. She had always been here. She would always be here. Forever. The darkness wrapped around her like a shroud, suffocating and complete. There were no edges, no boundaries, just an endless void that seemed to stretch forever. Time had no meaning here. No past. No future. Only the eternal present. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, but there was no air to breathe, no ground beneath her. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the emptiness, lost in a space where nothing could hear her. Her hands gripped at the air, as if trying to hold on to something, anything. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. And then, a whisper. Faint. Like a rustle in the distance. Her name. Sarah. Her eyes snapped open. But she wasn't sure when they had closed. The void had dissolved, leaving behind a place that was both familiar and foreign. She stood again, though her legs felt weak. The ground beneath her was solid now, the road back, stretching out before her in a familiar curve. She looked around, but there was no sign of the figure. For a moment, it felt safe. Almost peaceful. But Sarah knew better. She couldn't trust it. The air still felt heavy, thick with an unsettling energy that prickled her skin. She took a hesitant step forward, and then another. Each footstep seemed to echo louder than the last, reverberating into the stillness around her. The road, The road felt like it was calling her, urging her onward, as if it knew she had no choice. She looked up at the sky, hoping for some sign of change, some break in the darkness. But the stars were gone, replaced by a thick, swirling fog that hung low and oppressive. It moved like a living thing, slithering around the trees, crawling along the road. And there, at the edge of her vision, something stirred. Something dark. She couldn't tell what it was at first. A shadow? A shape? But as it moved closer, her heart stopped. It was the figure. It wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving toward her, gliding through the fog as if it had always been there, waiting for her. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run. To scream. But her body wouldn't obey. The figure came closer, its hollow eyes locking onto hers, empty and cold. It smiled again. A smile that stretched too wide, far too wide. The sound of its teeth clicking together echoed in her mind. "You're here now," it said, its voice a soft rasp. The words were not just spoken, they were felt. Asterisk in her bones. In her very soul, asterisk. Sarah trembled, the cold sinking deeper into her skin, into her very core. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers moving toward her. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. And as those fingers brushed against her skin, she felt it, the pull. A force stronger than anything she had ever known. The road, the figure, the darkness around her, it all began to close in, wrapping around her, suffocating her again. And then, with a sudden, sickening lurch, Sarah was falling. Falling through the road itself, through the ground, through layers of endless night. She screamed, but no sound came. Only the suffocating void, the crushing weight of the darkness pressing against her. And then, before she could even comprehend what was happening, everything stopped. She was back. Back on the road. The figure was gone, but the air was still heavy with its presence. Her hands shook as she stood up. Her eyes darted frantically around, but there was no one. No sign of movement. But the road stretched before her, the same endless path, the same never-ending stretch of darkness. She looked down at her feet, and for the first time, she realized. She wasn't walking on the road anymore. She was part of it. Her feet had merged with the asphalt, her skin melding with the black surface, as if the road had claimed her. And in that moment, Sarah understood. She wasn't a passenger. She wasn't just lost. She was the road. And the road would never let her go. The road seemed to stretch on forever, as it always had. But this time, Sarah felt something different. Something deep inside her, like a whisper in the back of her mind, telling her that she had crossed a line she could never return from. The shadows that had once terrified her now felt familiar. Comfortable, even. Her feet dragged along the asphalt, though it no longer felt like she was walking. It was more like the road itself was pulling her forward, guiding her along its endless, twisting path. The trees, the sky, they had all melted away into a blur of darkness. Only the road remained. And it was hers now. A part of her. She could feel it in her bones, a gnawing certainty that the road had been waiting for her. That it had always been her road. It was no longer just a place, it was a prison. She was a prisoner, bound by the very earth beneath her. Her body felt foreign, detached from herself, as though she were both inside and outside of it. The world had become a void, a space between worlds, and she was caught in the middle. Sarah tried to look around, but the road was all she could see. The sky was gone, replaced by an impenetrable blackness that swallowed her every thought. There was no escape. No end to this eternal journey. A sudden gust of wind howled past her, but it wasn't the wind that chilled her, it was the sound. A familiar, guttural growl. That same noise she had heard so many times before. The figure. It was here. But it wasn't the same. It didn't need to walk anymore. It didn't need to move. It was the road. It was the darkness. And now, it was a part of her. Sarah could feel the figure's presence surrounding her, an invisible weight that pressed down from every direction. It wasn't watching her anymore. It was inside her. The smile. The eyes. The emptiness. It was all her. She realized, with horror, that she was no longer just part of the road. She was the road. And now, the road would never let her go. There was no escape. There never had been. She was bound to it. Forever. The road stretched on endlessly, as it always had. But this time, something felt different. The air was thick with an eerie calm, a stillness that made Sarah's skin crawl. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't even trying to. It was as though she had stopped caring, stopped struggling against the inevitable pull of the road beneath her feet. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, and each one felt heavier than the last. The black asphalt seemed to shift under her, pulsing with a life of its own. Every direction she turned only led her back to where she had been, as if the road itself had closed in on her, trapping her in an endless loop. And then, in the distance, she saw it. The figure. It was standing there, right where it had always been. Tall. Unmoving. But this time, Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't feel fear. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance, like she had finally come to understand something about the road, about herself, about the place she had found herself in. The figure didn't need to move anymore. It was no longer an entity separate from her, it was a part of her, just as much as the road was. It had always been a part of her. It had always been there, waiting for her to realize the truth. The road wasn't a place. It wasn't something she was trapped in. She was the road. The figure was simply a reflection of everything she had become. Sarah took a deep breath, the air heavy in her lungs. She wasn't lost anymore. She wasn't searching for an escape. Because, in the end, she realized she had always been here. Always been a part of it. The road. The figure. The endless night. It was all one. And now, it was hers. Her eyes, once filled with fear, were now empty, just like the road. She turned back toward the endless horizon, and as she did, a faint, familiar whisper echoed in her mind. "You're home." And with that, she stepped forward. Forever.